This lesson is on yeast. It's very important to understand how it works, and it's interesting because without it, we couldn't make alcohol. In the beginning stages of fermentation, yeast feeds on oxygen in the juice. At this time, you'll see the byproduct carbon dioxide in the form of bubbles and foam, and you'll see this on top of your juice as fermentation starts. Once much of the oxygen is consumed, then the yeast actually turns to feed on the sugars, and it's during this time that alcohol is produced. As sugars run out and the alcohol level rises, yeast can no longer survive and dies off. It's important to understand that the strain of yeast you choose will greatly impact the outcome of your wine. You want to talk to your wine supply store for the best yeast strain to meet your desired wine outcome, but I will make my recommendation on the kind of yeast that I would use and the kind I do use for both my dry and sweet wines. Some strands of yeast can even withstand higher alcohol levels, thus consuming more sugar, resulting in a drier wine and as an end result. Some yeast is also recommended for sweet wines because it doesn't last as long, but that can get really tricky, and I wouldn't get into that just yet. I would just stick with using the yeast I recommend and the method that I'm going to teach you. You're going to come out with a great dry or sweet wine either way. Now keep in mind, the longer the yeast survives, the more sugar is consumed, and the more alcohol that will be produced, thus equaling your achieved outcome. That's why it's important that we add a yeast nutrient, which I'll talk about in a second. Adding sugar can also increase your alcohol level. We'll get back to more on this later, but there's a good chance we're going to be adding sugar to get your potential alcohol to the recommended level. Now, wild yeast is naturally found on all grape skins, but this yeast can be very unpredictable and it's unreliable. For these reasons, I recommend that you buy a strain that we can control, again, the kind that I will recommend later. We really don't want to rely on that wild yeast and ruin our wine. So we'll kill that, but again, more on that later. As an important ingredient that introduces nitrogen, which will allow the yeast to stay healthy and active. That's yeast nutrient. Again, I mentioned that just a few slides ago. It's going to make sure that our fermentation cycle goes as long as it can, and that's important because if fermentation slows down and stops too soon, you can be left with a wine that has problems producing something like a rotten smell, for example. Yeast nutrient can also be used to jumpstart, again, a sluggish or a juice that is not starting to ferment after you've added your yeast. But again, we'll talk more about yeast nutrient and adding that later on when we actually start to make wine.